Hey guys, Henning from FlippedNormals here, and in today's tutorial we are going to go through the basics of lighting in Blender. We'll go through the most common types of lights, and also you'll learn how to set up an HDRI from scratch as well. So the way we make a light in Blender is by hitting Shift and A, and then we go here under light, and here you can pick one of 4 kinds of lights. Which one you pick right now isn't that important because you can change this later on. We are going to be starting off with a point light. Now we are using cycles here with a GPU acceleration enabled. So we switched this to cycles and we're using GPU here instead of CPU. Then we have around 1,000 samples here, around 900 samples in the viewport, and this will just give us a nice smooth result in the viewport. So now that we have the point light here, we first just have to move this out a little bit so you can actually see what's going on because he's in the middle of the monkey here, which we can't have. Now we access the settings for the light under the object properties, which is down here. This is always the green one. If you have a camera, you can see it's green now, and if you have a light, you can also see it's green. Now this will be called point light, and if you change this to another kind of light, it does not change the name, so be aware of that. Another thing to be aware of as well is that you can see that I've enabled the disable and renders toggle as well. You can do that by going up here to the filters, and then you can enable this one. It's really important this is enabled, because otherwise if you have a light like this and you hide it right now it's only hidden in the viewport. It's not actually hidden in a render. So if you do a render now, you can now see that this light is still very much visible in the render while it's not visible in the viewport. So while this looks like the final render, this is actually not the final render. So be aware of that. Enable restriction toggles, enable this one, and make sure to disable both at the same time. So the point light is a point in space. It's a very simple kind of light. This is something that you would use for something like a light bulb, a candle, or anything like that, which is simply a point in space. Technically, this is the sun as well, considering that would be a big point in light, but you wouldn't practically use this for a sun at all because it's way too close to the object. So the settings we have for this would be the color, which simply changes the color of the light. I tried to keep it to white in the beginning, and then I add color later on. You can also change the value here as well, hue, saturation, and value right here as well, or you can use RGB and hex if you prefer that as well. You can also color pick something. So if you want to color pick really anything from the interface, you can do that as well. So now we just color pick that weird orange thing there. Then you can change the power of it. The power is the intensity. What I tend to do here is I generally adjust it up to a certain level. This depends a little bit on your scene, on your materials, textures, and the scale of your scene as well. And then once I'm happy with that, then this is when I tend to do math on it, where I simply type multiply by 2 to make it twice as strong, or I do divided by 2 to make it half as bright. So this is a slightly better way of doing it for me instead of just numerically tweaking this. Just because it's a little bit easier, it simply means you can make it twice as bright, yep, times 2. Can make it half as bright, yep, divided by 2. Then you also have the radius as well. For this, let's just increase this by something like 5 to make it much, much brighter. And just so we can see what the radius does. Now, if you want harsh shadows, you want the light to be really small, to be a small light source. And if you want soft shadows, you want this light source to be large. And this is what the radius is doing. If you see here, we change the radius all the way down to 0. Now we get really sharp shadows. And you can see this one here now becomes really small. But if we now change this to be something much, much bigger, almost like a meter now you can see that the radius is much larger and we have much, much softer shadows. Now, it's not better or worse to have harsh or soft shadows. That depends entirely on what you want to tell with the image. Then we have the sunlight. Now, we can simply just click here to convert this to sunlight, or we can Shift A, light and sun, and that's what we'll do now. And this just shows us that now this is named sun, and this is not named sun, even though it is indeed a sunlight. So just delete this one. And the sunlight is what you call in other software directional light. It's a very simple kind of light, and it doesn't have precision. It does not matter at all where you position it in space. The only thing that matters is the rotation of it. So this will emulate sunlight. It will emulate sunlight in a practical sense. Remember how I said the sun is technically just a point in space? Well, big point in space, but very far away. That's technically true, but it's practically useless because practically on Earth, if you need to emulate sunlight, you need just parallel rays. And that's what this one is doing. So this, you can see the render doesn't change at all if you move it. The only thing it changes is if we rotate it around. So if you start to rotate this around, you can just hit the R key for that. Now you can see that the render does change significantly based on that. Now, speaking of rotation, we have a few ways of rotating our lights. This is true for all the lights which has rotation, which would be these three ones here. Now, what we can do is, of course, we can just hit the R key and we can just rotate like this. But this is a pretty awkward way of doing it. You could also go in here and hit the Gizmo and you can rotate it. And you can hit the comma key and now you can go between local and global as well. This can be handy, but still it's a little bit awkward. The best way of doing it I've found is going either between hitting R twice, so R twice, and now you can really control it here. Or what you can do is you can change the target. You see you have this little gizmo on it here. You see a little device on the gizmo. This is the target of the light. So now if we were to just drag this to a certain point, you can now see that this snaps to the points we're hovering over. So this is really cool because this allows us to be very precise with lights. If we want a light to go directly into the skull here, into the eye of the skull, you can very finely tune it. And you can see if you hover over it as well, it says shortcut Shift and T, which means you can do it even faster. So if you want to really change this fast, you can just hold down Shift T and you just hover over different areas like so. It's a really fast way of doing it. Or you can hit double R and now this gives you, it's faster, but you have less control. It's much harder to be granular with this. So now you can see the position is exactly the same spot, but the rotation changes, so this changes drastically as well. Like with the other light as well, we can change the color. For sunlight, you really want to stay white unless you're going for something more stylized, or maybe a sunset. And we have strength as well. And then we have the angle. The angle also determines the sharpness of the shadow. So you can see here, the angle is really low, which means we get sharp shadows. This emulates sunlight pretty well because right now the sunlight is pretty sharp, but you can see what happens if we start to change the angle. Now it goes from proper sunlight to something like it's going through a cloud or something that it's like entirely diffused by clouds to the point that you have a hard time seeing more the exact direction of the sunlight. So this is a pretty cool way of doing it. If you're doing some kind of outdoor scene and you're doing and you have sunlight, I really recommend this light here. So let's delete this guy. Hit the X key, delete, Shift A, and then we're going to look at the spotlight. Then we can hit G and just move this guy up like so. The spotlight is pretty self-descriptive because the spotlight lights it based on a physical spotlight. So this is the kind of light you've seen if you've ever seen any kind of stage. So we can just move it into position like this, and let's increase the power significantly. So let's increase this by 10, and even this is not really enough. So now we can increase this by 10 again, and you can see how fast that is and how clean values we get. This is a really powerful light because it's a really cinematic light. This is by far the most appealing result we had on this monkey so far, where it looks like he's actually on stage right now. Now we have a few settings for this as well. We have color and power like we had before with the other ones. Then we have radius, which doesn't change the radius of the spot itself. It changes the radius of the light source. So now if you want something, the shadows to be harsh, you see here, it's set to 0. Or if you want it to be really soft, you just increase this to the desired number. So I really prefer to have harsh, like completely harsh shadows. You should never have shadows this harsh unless you're going for a very specific look. It just makes it look pretty CG, to be honest, and stuff, it just isn't that harsh in real life. You very, very rarely see harsh shadows. In order to control the actual shape as well, we just go right down here to beam shape. And this is where you have the actual size of the spot. So now you can change the actual size of this. You can make it really wide or you can make it really narrow like this as well. So this is really cool if you really want to make something like this, which is way more cinematic than what we got with something like the direction light or the sunlight. Now, the last light we're going to be talking about is going to be the area light. So select this light, X, delete, Shift A, light, and then area light. And then we are going to just move this guy up like so. And the arrow light is by far my favorite light. This is the one I use for lighting most things. This is similar to a light you would see on film sets as well, where it's simply a big plane and this shoots light through it. The advantage of this is that you get a very soft and controlled light. This is equivalent to having a lamp behind a big piece of white cloth so that the light comes out of this whole area. So this allows us to get really control what we want. So with this as well, we have a few settings. We have color and power, which is exactly what we had before. For this, we have to just increase this by something like 10 so we can see what's going on. Then we have the shape as well. Here we can choose between a square, a rectangle, a disc. So here, the big change here is that it changes between a circle and a square. Now, you wouldn't really do this for something like this. There's no practical advantage to going between a disc and a square for this, but there is a huge practical advantage if you have a lot of reflections. If you're doing something like a car or a product shot, you really want to control the shape of your light because it's going to be visible in reflections. Technically, this is now visible in reflections as well, but our reflections are so diffused, they're so scattered that we're not really going to be seeing them. There's no way you can see the shape of the light in this. So we are going to be setting this back to a square as well. So the area light is fantastic. It really allows to control things as well. You can see now that the shadows are incredibly soft, which while it's cool, can also be a problem because now you can't really control the softness of the shadows. Because in this case, let's move this over like so, and let's try to get something a little bit more, a little sharper. So in this case, the shadows are incredibly soft, and there isn't a setting for changing the changing the softness of it. And that's because, keep in mind, this is just a light bulb behind a piece of cloth. And what determines how soft it is how big is the piece of cloth. So while we technically don't have a setting for it, we do have size. And size very much determines the sharpness of shadows. So now you can see if we set this all the way down, you can see how sharp the shadows become. Or if you move this all the way up, you can see how soft the shadows become. In my work, I tend to work with something where I have semi-defined shadows. I don't like to have it really soft because then it loses all sense of direction. And I don't like to have it crazy sharp as well because I just find that to be too dramatic. So what you can do with lights as well is, of course, you can duplicate the lights as well. So in this case, once you're happy with the general result like this, you can hit Shift and D and this duplicates it right away. And then you can go in here and you can just start to rotate this light around. You can move it into position. I prefer to move it into position first and then hitting Shift and T and then just moving this in here. What I'm trying to do now is I want to have some kind of rim light on the character. So let's hit the G key and then we can just hit Shift T and it just was some rim light. Now you can see we're getting some nice rim light here as well. If you want to disable the gizmo so you can't see the gizmo at all, you can go up here and click on this key. And you can disable this as well. So then you can't see anything and it's just a pure render. So if you want this to be a little bit of a bigger rim, you just continue to move it over and then Shift and T. And then we can increase this. We can try to increase this by X and 5. Once I'm done with my overall lighting, let's say we're done with this for now, then that's when I start to play with colors. I try to get the values first and then we work with colors later on. It's also a good idea to name your lights right away. So we can name this something like a key light, and then we can name this something like a rim light. Because once you have a lot of lights, it becomes very hard to manage this properly. So what I often tend to do is I tend to have some color in all my lights. So in my key light, I'll just add a little bit of a hue, just a little bit. You can change this around as much as you want, of course. You can change the rotation of the hue. And then I tend to go into my rim light. And I tend to make this a much stronger color. Now, this is entirely under personal preference, but I think something like this can look quite cool, where you can just really get some soft color in this, and then you get some really harsh saturation from something like this one here. So we can just move this down a little bit like so and scale her up a little bit. That's a bit too much. And this is really how you light. You use just a few sets of lights like this to create some very powerful results. Now, next up, we will have a look at the HDRI. Now, first thing, I'm just going to be grouping these guys up in putting them in collection. So just select them both, hit the M key for move to collection, and then we'll make a new collection and we'll call this lights. And I'm just gonna have an underscore col just to keep this nice and clean. So now you can see that our lights are now in the collection. Then we're gonna turn off the entire collection like so, just so we aren't gonna be using these lights anymore. Then we will change the interface. In this case, I have already customized the interface and I've made this into a shader editor. Now, what you have to do is you have to go from object to world. If by object, this is where you can actually change the shader of the object, which is nice. But if you go to world, this is where you're actually changing the world shader. And this is a really cool concept, which is essentially it's ambient light. If you're looking around your room right now, or if you're outside, a lot of the lighting, most of the lighting will be coming from an ambient light. You can't necessarily see a direct light source. It's just kind of light coming from everywhere. And that is what this is doing. Now, we have a background node here, and this has a color. In this case, it's black, and this is very deliberate to make our lighting a bit easier. Now, if we were to click on this and make this brighter, now you can see we get this nice ambient lighting. This means that the lighting is coming from absolutely everywhere in the entire scene. From the environment around it. It doesn't come from the objects themselves. And this is boring. There's nothing fancy at all in this. This is just a color with a value of almost 0.35, and that's it. So this is like the most boring lighting in the world. Now you can spice this up with color, but where you can really spice this up if you are using what's called HDRI images, high dynamic range images. You can get these from sites like HDRIhaven.com, which is what I prefer to use, where you have free HDRIs you can use, and they're absolutely fantastic. Now, before we use that, you need to use an add-on called Node Wrangler. So just make sure to enable the Node Wrangler, and this is going to make it a lot easier. You technically don't need it, but it's going to make your work a lot easier. Now, select the background node and hit Control and T. And now you can see this has created a few nodes for us. It has also made our render nice and pink. And this is because we now have an environment texture, but it's missing the actual textures. And this is a familiar look to anyone who's open a Blender scene and the textures are missing. So what we can do is now we can go under environment texture and we can open this up. And this is where we can navigate to our HDRI location. I already have a location here where I download a fair few from HDRI Haven. And I'm just going to be picking one here. Now, which one you pick isn't really that important for the tutorial, but it is very important for your lighting because this changes dramatically what your lights look like. So I'm just going to be hiding the backdrop here. And now you can see what's happening. We have an image which is actually lighting up the scene, which means your lighting will feel a lot more natural. And particularly if you have reflections, it's going to feel significantly more interesting. So what we can do now, we can just go into our shader and we can just change this to be a much rougher material so that we can see more of the reflection. Sorry, much less rough of material. We want it to be a much shinier material. And then this becomes a little scary because you have two nodes here and there are a lot of things here and fancy names like vector. Well, the only thing you really have to worry about now is rotation and Z. And this is going to rotate the image around the Z axis. So what you can see happening now is that first the background is changing, and also the lighting on the model changes drastically, which is incredibly cool because this means that you can change the overall light on your entire scene or model very fast. Plus it feels so natural. It's really hard to make something like this feel proper natural by using something like a 3-point light setup. You can make it look really cool with something like the light setup we just had, and you can really make it exactly what you want it to be. But if you want something to feel photoreal, you pretty much have to use something like an HDRI. Whenever I do anything with photorealism in mind, I always use an HDRI, at least as a base. And then, of course, there's nothing wrong with adding this on top of it. Because now you can see we're getting the nice reflections and the ambience from the HDRI. And then we can add our special lights on top to really art direct it like this. So this is what I often do. I might be setting the strength to something like 0.3 just to get a bit of ambience and color variation in it. And then I'm using this light here or this light setup here to really make the lighting nice. Now, something you might want to do as well is you want to use a different background for this. This is something that you really want to do quite a lot. It's where you want this light, but you really don't want this background here for whatever reason. So what you can do, you can add a few nodes to this, and that means that you can control the background color completely independently from the lights. So the first thing we'll do is we will hit Shift and A, and we will make a light path node. So light path, and just put this here. And then we'll use add a mix shader node. And then we'll put this color here, or this environment texture into shader 1. Then we'll put the background into shader 2. Then we'll put the mix shader, the end result of this, under the surface. We'll cut away the node here. We don't want this, the connection here. We don't want this to be connected. And now you can see this blends between the color we have and the actual image. But we don't want to blend between using just a value. We want to blend between using camera rays. So in the light path node is camera ray. You drag from here under the FAC. And now you can see that the lighting here is entirely independent of the background. Now, if you were to rotate this around now, you see the lighting changes, but the background colors remain the same. So now we can go in here and we can change the background color, and we can change the lighting here as well. This is a really cool trick I use quite a lot when I really want the HDRI to be independent of the background color. You could, of course, just render out a mask as well and do this in Photoshop, but it's really nice to be able to do this directly in the render like so. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot about lighting in Blender. If you have any cool tips about lighting in Blender, or if there is something we missed in this tutorial, feel free to let us know in the comments. We would love to hear your tips and tricks about lighting in Blender. And if you liked this video, make sure to give a thumbs up and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.